Its name simply means desert. And what could be more appropriate for this infinite space? The Sahara is the largest desert in the world. It covers well over 3 million square miles and takes up more than a quarter of the African continent. It's like a great wave spreading over 10 countries, extending 3,230 miles from the Atlantic to the shores of the Red Sea and 950 miles from north to south. The formation of a desert is a phenomenon caused by the climate. It stems from a constant imbalance between the quantity of rainfall and the amount of evaporation. The Sahara is a desert because of the incredibly powerful permanent anticyclone at its center. Any humid air that approaches it, whether hot or cold, is forcibly pushed away, and with it goes any possibility of rain. The conventional image of the Sahara is of stretches of dunes interspersed with arid, sandy wastes. There are, of course, very large areas like that, but in fact they only account for 20% of the total area of the desert. They're known by the Arabic word erg. It's not the ergs, but the regs that dominate. These are flat, barren and stony, and they're among the most desolate, hostile environments on Earth. In the Sahara, the topography is in the main fairly low. The mountain masses are rare and isolated. The summits of the Hogar in Algeria and the Tibesti in Chad rise to 10,000 feet. The third mountain mass, the Aïr in Niger, is quite a lot lower. All the other relief has been subjected to an intense process of demolition for millions of years. The desert is a defenseless space at the mercy of wind, heat and cold. In the same day, intense cold can follow extreme heat. The temperature difference can be as much as 40 degrees centigrade. Rocks split apart as a result of these violent temperature changes. The wind, armed with grains of sand, has left outcrops of very hard rock, which it has sculpted and polished. Erosion in all its forms has produced a sumptuous variety of landscapes. The extraordinary diversity of the Great Desert is revealed in all its splendor in Niger. In the Tenere Desert, there are great mountains of sand, 700 to 1,000 feet high and more than 6.5 miles long. Here, the sand of the Tenere encroaches on the rocks of the Aïr. The place is called Arakau, the crab's claw, a rocky cirque cut in two by an arrow of sand. The Aïr is one of 3 massifs in the Sahara. It's of volcanic origin. It appeared at the same time as the Hogar in Algeria. Here, the highest summits are only just over 6,500 feet. The Aïr Massif has a kind of microclimate within the Sahara. There's still very little rainfall, but more than elsewhere. This is due partly to the altitude and partly to the presence of volcanic mountain masses. Made white-hot by the burning sun, they store up large quantities of heat, and this occasionally creates a zone of low pressure on the massif. The rainy season barely lasts 2 months. It just about tops up the groundwater table. Depending on the nature of the soil, the water is either immediately absorbed or trickles along the rocks. Sometimes it filters down into pockets from which, much later, blessed springs of fresh water will bubble up to the surface. The basalt imposes a course and offers a succession of natural basins. Down at the bottom, the water flows into a natural bowl, which stays pretty well full all year round. These permanent water holes are called agelman by the Berbers. The Arabs usually call them gelta. This one, the Timia gelta, is one of the most beautiful in the Sahara. Apart from these few spectacular water holes, the Sahara also has occasional large fossil aquifers deep down. Some of them seem inexhaustible. These huge, unexpected reserves can only have been formed during much more humid ages. They're the last traces of vast expanses of water that used to cover the Sahara. 100 million years ago, instead of desert, there were seas here, and lakes and marshes. The environment is so different today that it would seem hard to believe if it weren't for the remarkable number of traces of that bygone age that the desert has preserved. Each era, each climatic upheaval has left its mark. These more or less readable fragments are dinosaur fossils. They died here about 100 million years ago. To the south and southeast of the Ayir, 6 to 10 foot thick layers of sandstone appear on the surface, which bear witness to a time when forests grew on this dry wasteland. When they died, the trees were gradually covered by sandy deposits and eventually disappeared altogether. Over a period of hundreds of millions of years, their plant fibers were replaced by mineral matter. The process was so slow, so delicate, that the silica took the place of the wood fiber without changing the slightest detail. These silicified woods, eventually uncovered by erosion, have retained even the cracks and growth rings in the trees. The history of the Sahara is extremely complex, and even in a more recent past on the geological scale, the region went through major upheavals. During the last 2 million years, its features have changed several times. The Sahara went through a relatively humid period as little as 10,000 years ago, and the desert as we now know it has only been there for about 5,000 years. 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, elephant, buffalo and hippopotamus abounded in the region. In those days there was plenty of game for the local population to bring down with their lances and arrows. There's a story that comes from that time when there was an abundance of meat about those rocks whose shape and patina make them look a bit like huge chunks of cured meat. The story has it that a long time ago all the rocks in the Ayir Massif were pieces of meat, which was a blessing because there was plenty to eat. All you had to do was bend down and pick up the amount you needed. This went on until the day when, for some obscure reason, God felt he had been offended by man, and to punish him, decided to turn all that food into stones. Those who don't believe this story have another explanation for the way the stones look. They say that they used to be soft, but that they were hardened by so much sun. At all events, it's generally agreed that the rock engravings of Davos date back to the age of the soft stones. These traces were drawn by herdsmen who kept their cattle on this southern part of the Aïr. Alongside their domestic animals, they mainly depicted giraffes. These here, cut into a sloping rock, are considered to be the oldest representations. The Dabos giraffes are one of the finest primitive artworks in the Sahara. They're very rare indeed, in that they're virtually life-size. Giraffe disappeared from this landscape once and for all in more recent times. Over the last few centuries, hunting and drought have completely eradicated those large animals from this part of the world. Small Dorcas gazelles are also ruthlessly hunted and are becoming more and more rare. Still, the Sahara is home to a surprising range of animals all the same. Many birds, more than 100 mammals, and just as many species of reptiles, half of them lizards. This animal is the totem of the people who live on the Jado Plateau in the northeast of Niger. It's said that it saved a village by beating its tail against a drum to warn its inhabitants that their enemies were approaching. Since then, to show their gratitude, the people of the Jado Plateau never kill it or eat it. In fact, they protect it. Most animals here live their lives at night. During the day, they keep a low profile. It's a question of survival in view of the heat. If you go out in the sun, you have to be absolutely sure of finding shelter. In this hostile environment, there are still some places that are more hospitable. They can be recognized from a distance by the thin strips of green that brighten the monotonous stretches of sand and rocks. They're called corries, and they're riverbeds, most often dry. The trees and bushes that grow on these banks have to seek moisture deep down, so their roots are highly developed. Rather in the same way as an iceberg, what we see on the surface is only about 1/10 of the total size of the plant. One bush stands out in this rather poor vegetation. Botanists call it Calotropis procera, but it's more commonly known as the apple tree of Sodom or the Senegal silk tree. Here it's the all-purpose tree. In traditional medicine, it's recognized for its many therapeutic virtues. Almost all the components of the plant go into medicinal compounds which are used to treat everything from colds to leprosy to syphilis. The seed of its fruit is surrounded by a silvery padding which is used to fill cushions. The wood is very light, and the Tuaregs use it for making the frames of their beds and tents. The banks of these corries still have scattered sedentary populations. Here and there are sufficient alluvial deposits to provide arable land, especially if the water in the subsoil is easy to extract. Here the traditional wells are called anu. They're dug down between 30 and 50 feet. By an ingenious process, the emptying funnel is held closed as the container is pulled up, making it watertight. The water is poured into little channels to irrigate the gardens. Each well provides enough for at most just over an acre. The large number of wells that have been dug in the most favourable places have created real little oases where man seems to have made his mark on the desert. It's a fragile balance. If too many wells are dug and the scant reserves of water overexploited, the desert will quickly reassert itself. Overexploitation of wells and excessive grazing have led to the expansion of the desert to the south of the Sahara. During the last 50 years, it has grown by a staggering 250,000 square miles. In places like this, man is bound to lead a nomadic life. Even if it occurs to him to settle, he must resign himself to the fact that it won't be for long. In the middle of the 18th century, there was a town of 10,000 inhabitants here. It was called Asode, and it used to be the capital of the Aïr. Asode probably disappeared for economic reasons. The town owed its prosperity to commerce, but when the trade routes became dangerous at the end of the 18th century, caravans came by less and less often, commerce declined, and the town was gradually abandoned. The Tuaregs have a different version of the story. They say Asode was destroyed by a terrible wind that blew on the Aïr and flattened the mosque and all the houses in one fell swoop. Asode was abandoned by its last inhabitants less than 100 years ago, and most traces of human life have already reverted to the colours of the landscape. It's as though nature were hurrying to reclaim territory conceded to temporary occupants, but only for a time. These stones might well have been piled up naturally. In fact, they're the tombs of nomadic herdsmen from northern Kenya. This is the beginning of an arid wasteland. Thousands of square miles of dusty savanna, scorched earth, bare rocks and dried up rivers. The Matthews chain marks the entrance to this territory. There's a simple landmark beyond which the further north you travel, the more hostile everything becomes. The sabaki, a sort of decapitated sugar loaf. It's an Inselberg, a block of hard rock which has resisted erosion better than the geological structures around it. This is one of the most impressive Inselbergs in Africa. Its real name is Oldoño Sabaki Lololokwe, and for the Samburu people, it's the refuge of the god Ngai. The Samburus are related to the Maasai. At one time they were part of the same tribe. They come from the Nile region. The Samburus broke away in the 15th century when they migrated to the south. Like other herdsmen in this region, their way of life has changed very little in the last few centuries. Their huts are made of interwoven branches covered with animal hides. From a very early age, Samburus learn to sing and develop their sense of rhythm. This is important not only so that they can take part in ritual ceremonies, but also to sustain them in their daily tasks. The members of this tribe invariably repeat the same chants and gestures every morning. This year, the rains from the previous season have amply filled the groundwater table. The water is near at hand, and there was no need to dig far into the riverbed. After a period of drought, it can be necessary to dig deep to find water. The first man in the chain sometimes ends up at the bottom of a pit 30 to 50 feet deep. No matter, the rhythm and chanting go on just the same. That's why the local people say the men are at the singing wells. It's one of the last places on the way north where the water is this accessible. Further on, the heat gets even more intense. The wind blows harder. There's a sense that this is no place for human beings. The desert doesn't begin all at once. The landscape changes gradually. The vegetation becomes more unusual, more sparse. In this environment, a flower seems like a miracle or a mistake. To survive in this inhospitable environment sometimes means walking between 30 and 60 miles. That can be the distance between two watering places. It's often necessary to make do with the not very clear water to be found in a luga, which is the local name for dry riverbeds. But sometimes, here and there, the volcanic rock acts as a filter to provide the luxury of really clear water. At the end of the 19th century, two European explorers, Count Teleki and Lieutenant von Hörnel, crossed these dusty fields dotted with lumps of basalt. The area was still unknown. Geographers of that time who'd heard stories told by local people suspected that there might be a large expanse of water there somewhere. The more they penetrated these arid wastes, the more unlikely their hypothesis became. And yet, one stifling day in March 1888, the chimera became real. After a 13-month trek, Teleki and von Hörnel saw shimmering on the horizon of a lava field the unreal contours of the Great Water. They had discovered the last of the great African lakes. The indigenous people call it Basso Narok. The whites first named it Lake Rudolph in honor of the Austrian Archduke. Today it's officially called Lake Turkana, but for all the poets, it's the Sea of Jade. Lake Turkana lies in the northernmost part of Kenya, bordering on Ethiopia and the Sudan. It's 180 miles long and about 20 miles wide. Its depth does not exceed 500 feet, and in places it's barely 30 feet. It's shaped like a finger beckoning to the traveller to approach its magic waters. This jade colour is due to a high concentration of green algae which rise to the surface of the water at times of the day when the weather is calm. The colour of the lake is intimately bound up with the direction of the prevailing winds. When the wind blows from the east, which it usually does from dawn till the end of the morning, the lake loses its lovely shade of green. It can even turn quite dark, which explains why the Africans sometimes call it Mbasso Narok, or the Black Lake. The Samburu, Rendi or Turkana herdsmen wander endlessly along the shores of the sun-beaten, wind-swept lake in search of pasture. It's strange to see them on such barren land, but their presence here goes back to the origins of humanity. On the eastern shore, many remains have been found of hominids, which prove that creatures with a relatively high level of intelligence lived by this lake 2 million years ago. Lake Turkana is probably one of the cradles of humanity. The climate was milder then and more humid, and the vegetation was more abundant. Instead of the few trees that remain today, there must have been vast tracts of forest, irrigated by rivers and inhabited by all sorts of animals that no longer exist. The miniature horse, the saber-toothed lion, and the euthycodon, a giant crocodile. People continue to live on these shores even though the land has become arid because the lake is a huge reservoir of drinking water. Sadly though, it's water that rehydrates without quenching your thirst because it's salty, but it's all there is. In spite of this brackish water, there's a large population of freshwater fish in Lake Turkana. That's probably what attracted the Molos to its shores. There are fewer than 500 of them, and they were for a long time considered to be the smallest tribe in Africa. Threatened with extinction, for the last 30 years the Molos have mixed their blood with other local tribes. By intermarrying with their Samburu or Turkana neighbours, they have avoided extinction, even if it meant losing something of their identity. The El Molos say they used to live on the northern side of the lake and that they came here to the south 2,000 years ago because one day the women and children of their tribe were massacred by strangers while the men were out fishing. They also say that at one time, instead of looking after goats, they had herds of crocodiles, hippopotamus and turtles that they put to graze on the vast expanses of grass around the lake. To communicate, the El Molos use homing pigeons. For their food, they mainly count on the fish they catch in the lake, which they dry in the sun. Apart from fish, they also eat crocodile, hippopotamus and birds. For their everyday needs and equipment, the El Molos have learned to make do with the few raw materials they can find. The houses are built by the women, and they've been doing it the same way for thousands of years. They use dried palm leaves, which they assemble and arrange to cover a framework made of intertwined acacia branches. The huts are low, so they won't get blown away by the wind. Just to make sure, they're also weighed down with stones, or they'd be constantly fluttering around the lake shore like kites. The climate around Lake Turkana is one of the driest and hottest in the world. The temperature regularly goes up to 50 degrees centigrade, and the water is irresistibly tempting. Swimming is a great joy, and no one seems to worry about the crocodiles in the lake. There are thought to be between 10 and 20,000 of them. Occasionally there are accidents, but the risk is relatively minor because the Turkana crocodiles are mainly fish eaters. Also, their numbers are dwindling because they've been ruthlessly hunted by the Luo tribe. The lake is well stocked with tilapias and also Nile perch, a huge fish that can weigh up to 330 pounds. The experts reckon that the salinity of the water could double before the existence of these fish were really jeopardized. The El Molos build their rafts with one of the only trees that grow in the region, the doom palm. The doom palm is a very fibrous tree that quickly soaks up water, so however skillful the boatmen are, they can only stay out for a few hours at a time. The fragility of the boats and the storms that can get up on the lake at any moment obviously limit their field of action. For example, there's no question of venturing as far as the appropriately named Central Island, which is at the heart of the lake in both senses of the word. Central Island is not a big island. It only covers about 2 square miles and consists of 2 interconnected volcanic cones. The island appeared in the middle of the lake during one of the many volcanic eruptions that marked the history of the Rift Valley. Lake Turkana lies right along the Great African Rift. At one time it was linked to the Mediterranean by the Nile, but it was cut off when the region subsided and left isolated and transformed into a sort of inner sea. There's still volcanic activity just below the surface along the rift. Here it can be seen in the form of fumaroles and sulfur crystals. The island has 3 crater lakes which are intermittently replenished by the waters of the Sea of Jade. Each lake has its colors and characteristics. There's the Fish Lake. This one is the Crocodile Lake. The crocodiles come to the island to reproduce once a year. The third lake is the most spectacular. It's called the Flamingo Lake. The Flamingo Lake is not only the most perfect of the crater lakes, but its waters are festooned with flamingos like a gorgeous pink decoration. Central Island offers an image of eternal nature. It's a protected site attached to the Kenyan National Park of Sibiloi. And yet, the flamingos could one day leave the Sea of Jade. For the moment, they can still find the algae they eat there, but if the salinity of the lake should rise too much, they'll move on. From year to year, the waters of Lake Turkana get more and more salty. The lake is shrinking under the combined effects of the wind and the sun, which exacerbate the evaporation process. The level of the lake drops nearly 12 inches a month, and it only rains seriously here once every 2 years. The only way the loss is made up is by the water flowing into the north of the lake from the Ethiopian river Omo. But the Omo has been diverted so much for irrigation purposes that it's becoming a mere trickle compared to what it was. In 100, 1,000 or 10,000 years, these magic waters will perhaps be no more than a mythical memory, the Sea of Jade, a brief episode in the continent's history. The southern part of Africa is covered with the largest stretch of sand in the world, 620,000 square miles. That's even more than the vast areas of dunes and sand plains in the Sahara. This covering of sand begins north of the equator in the Congo Republic and extends down as far as the northern frontiers of South Africa. It stretches over 930 miles from Angola to Zimbabwe. This sand was formed tens of millions of years ago, even before the continental drift began. All of present-day Southwest Africa then consisted of a huge basin full of rocks, and over time the process of erosion reduced them to fine sand. This blanket of sand does not have a uniform appearance. It can look quite different according to latitude, climate, and the thickness of the layer. This is where it's most spectacular, in the Kalahari Desert. It covers 225,000 square miles, mainly in Botswana, but also in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, and South Africa, where the Orange River marks its southern boundary. The sand in the Kalahari owes its beautiful reddish colour to iron oxide. The drier the climate, the more vivid the colour. In the north of the Kalahari, where it rains more, the humidity causes a chemical reaction which turns the sand grey, and yet it's of exactly the same composition. A region that gets less than 10 inches of rainfall a year is generally considered to be a desert. The average rainfall in the southwest of the Kalahari is less than 8 inches, whereas to the east it's more than 14 inches. But considerable variations have been noted even over short periods. Some years, certain regions had only 2.5 inches of rain, and a few years later they had 10 times more. At all events, the Kalahari is very much a desert. The rivers and lakes are dry. The rate of evaporation is such that it could absorb 10 times the annual rainfall. In summer, the air temperature is above 40 degrees centigrade, but that's nothing compared to the ground temperature, where the surface of the sand can reach 70 degrees centigrade. A large number of animals live here in spite of the extreme conditions. A few typical specimens of various types of African fauna are to be found. The water and food resources in the driest parts of the Kalahari are too poor for elephants or buffalo. This harsh environment is no place for giraffes either. But lions are quite at home here. Kalahari lions were for a long time said to be larger than others, and it was even claimed that they belonged to a specific species. There's actually no truth in this, and the idea probably arose because the nature of the landscape makes them look bigger than they really are. In spite of the apparent abundance of various antelopes, which would seem to be the ideal prey, Kalahari lions often live on porcupines. The thing is, they can't count too much on there being a good supply of springboks or gemsboks, which are constantly migrating and sometimes disappear from the lion's territory altogether to seek food and water elsewhere, depending on the prevailing conditions. Here, the lions don't follow them in their migration. The gemsbok is the animal that has best adapted to the scorching heat of the Kalahari. Instead of wasting moisture by sweating, this large antelope can let its body temperature rise to 45 degrees centigrade, which would kill any other animal. The secretary bird and the kori bustard are among the birds which are also well adapted to these difficult conditions. The ostrich, which rarely seeks shade, also has remarkable resistance to heat. It can stand temperatures of over 50 degrees centigrade for 7 hours at a time without its inner body temperature going up at all. In conditions of intense dehydration, the ostrich can lose up to a quarter of its weight without serious consequences. A large variety of birds live in the Kalahari. Some are sedentary, but many are just passing through. Some blend extraordinarily well into the landscape. These huge nests hanging here and there are very common in the Kalahari. They're made by a species of weaver birds which live in communities. Each of these nests can house up to 300 birds. They're divided into chambers, each of which is occupied by one pair of birds. They go on living in the nest even after the fledglings have been born and bred, because it protects them against heat and predators. These nests are so heavy that occasionally the branch breaks and the whole colony ends up on the ground. The main preoccupation of all the inhabitants of the Kalahari is getting enough water. But even when everything seems desperately dry, nature has unexpected resources. There are wild plants that grow here and there, bearing fruit right down at ground level, and that saves many lives. These tsama melons contain 90 to 95% water and a lot of vitamin C. They're eaten one way or another by most of the animal species: insects, birds, antelopes, and carnivores. The southward progress of the Kalahari sands was stopped by the Orange River, which barred their way, carrying off huge quantities towards the sea. Since those days, the river too has had its life. It has dug its bed in the granite, sharpening or smoothing the bends, carving out holes, sculpting giant cauldrons. This is the place of the loud noises, or Karebis in Hottentot dialect, which has gradually become Ograbi. At Ograbi Falls, the Orange River gushes over the granite rim and plunges 230 feet to the bottom of a gorge. Down through the ages, the orange has worn away the rock downstream from the falls and created this narrow 12.5-mile long gorge. For millions of years, the orange has seen it all, including more humid times, but mainly long periods of drought. Whatever happens, tumultuous or listless, it wends its long, winding way to the Atlantic.